For some of us, there comes a moment when certainty begins to fall away. Sometimes it happens through spiritual insight, or we become disillusioned with the religion we were brought up in. Sometimes through psychological work, we begin to see our strategies aren't working anymore. Sometimes we go through such trauma or illness, we're betrayed, we experience deep political disillusionment, or we simply live long enough to see that the old pillars of society are no longer holding steady. When the beliefs that once organized our lives may lose their authority, when the moral rules that once felt solid no longer feel sufficient, when the stories that promised meaning, justice, or protection stop working in the way we hoped they would, well, this is when certainty could really come in handy, and yet it is gone. This work is not about trying to rebuild certainty. It's about learning how to live ethically when certainty is no longer there. The premise is simple, though not easy. When certainty collapses, ethical life depends less on belief systems that we can adopt and more on our capacities. Because in the hardest moments, belief alone is often not enough for us. It may comfort us. It may inspire us. It may help us orient. But it does not always carry us through the situations that are the most painful, the most complex, or the most demanding. And when certainty falls away and our capacities are not yet strong enough to meet the moment, we tend to wobble. We may become rigid, or go numb. We may freeze. We may detach and call it peace. We may become cynical and call it wisdom. This is why capacity matters. Spiritual training can be beautiful, it can be profound, but it doesn't always address this part of being a whole person. Sometimes it leaves us with the impression that once we've had a genuine spiritual insight, once we've glimpsed unity or touched non-duality, we should be settled, as though realization itself should remove confusion, as though insight should hand certainty back to us in a more elevated form. I don't think that's how it works. I think insight often begins a different kind of work, because once we see beyond the old divisions, once we begin to understand that separation is not quite what we thought it was, well, a new question appears. How do we live? How do we behave? How do we move through conflict, grief, power, responsibility, love, and limitation? How do we live as though non-separation is real, not just beautiful to think about, but real enough to shape our conduct? I do not often hear that part spoken about clearly. And psychological work, while deeply valuable, is not always enough either. It can help us understand our patterns. It can help us trace those patterns back to their roots. It can help us interrupt conditioned behaviors and suffer less inside them. That matters. It matters a great deal. But even that does not fully answer the question, how do I act here, now, when no option is clean, no outcome is guaranteed, and my own comfort is not the primary ethical concern anymore? I am in relationship, and I wish those relationships to thrive, not wither. A person may understand, for example, that they withdraw during conflict because they learned early on that overwhelm was dangerous. They may become more aware, They may learn to stay present. They may learn to speak more honestly. They may tolerate more discomfort as time goes on. That's real growth. But insight alone does not determine response. At a certain point, self-understanding reaches its edge, and something more is asked of us. Not just why am I like this, but now that I see more clearly, how shall I live? To me, that's where ethical adulthood begins. It begins where explanation starts to run out. It begins where certainty can no longer carry us. It begins in the live moment when we're asked to choose how to behave in a real situation with real stakes among other real people. And maybe part of maturity is also letting go of the idea that we're fixed, mechanical, trait-led beings. Yes, we are conditioned, of course we are, but we are also capable of learning, capable of practicing, capable of becoming more honest, more steady, more humane. Seeing through our masks can be liberating, but seeing through them is not the same as living differently. That's why the work continues. Once we begin to see how our habits create suffering, the next question is, what do we practice instead? What do we strengthen? What do we return to? What helps us stay in contact with reality, with one another, and with our own responsibility? The 5 capacities that follow are my response to that question. I'm not offering them as traits, not as identities, not as virtues to admire from a distance. Now, I'm offering them as skills, skills that can be learned, practiced, and strengthened over time. And before we move into them, I want to say a word about the ethical ground beneath this work. This framework is grounded in relational, situational ethics, not in fixed belief systems, not in promised outcomes, and not in the hope that purity will save us. Its commitments are practical. Reduce harm, preserve dignity, take responsibility for impact, including the downstream effects, not just immediate intention. Practice accountability without shame. Pay attention to power. Recognize that those with greater safety, access, and structural leverage carry greater responsibility for change. Offer compassion, but do not confuse compassion with rescue. And through it all, remember, impact matters more than intention. This framework also asks us to be cautious with the stories we tell ourselves, especially when those stories soothe us at the cost of honesty. We all reach for comfort. We all make meaning. This is part of being alive. But when our stories help us avoid responsibility, distort power, or break faith with shared reality, well, they become too expensive. So ethical action, as I mean it here, isn't measured by purity or certainty or good intentions alone. It's measured by capacity and impact, by whether what we do reduces harm, by whether it preserves dignity, by whether it remains coherent with the reality we actually share. So, if capacity is what carries ethical life when certainty falls away, then the question becomes, what are those capacities? And how do we develop them in our actual lives? There are 5, and we begin with the most foundational, our ability to tolerate discomfort.